Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Gaza, under attack and under occupation. But beyond a full ceasefire, what will change the fortunes of Gaza's people and economy? We talk to the Palestinian Minister of Economy about unemployment, poverty and natural gas. Also this week, the US-Africa summit as Washington tries to recapture the hearts of Africa's leaders. And it might be too little too late after China's trillion-dollar march across the African continent. And the outbreak that'll cost millions to contain and could wipe millions from entire economies. We look at the potentially huge effects of Ebola in West Africa. So we're looking at Gaza this week, which has rightly been front and centre on our screens for the past month. An Israeli offensive that's killed almost 2,000 people, destroyed large parts of the Strip and caused untold damage to an already besieged economy. Now, without ignoring the huge losses Gaza has suffered, that is what we want to focus on this week, the economy under attack and under siege. Just what does that do to an economy and what needs to change? Because what's interesting is that Gaza's economy actually grew at a rate of 14.7% in the years of 2010 and 2011. A lot of that was due to the Rafah crossing with Egypt being open. By 2012, though, that number was down to 6.6%, and we were also looking at unemployment at 41% and poverty rate of 39% as well. So no surprise then that growth per capita is only $1,715, half of that over in the occupied West Bank. Add on to that what's happened in the last month in Gaza. Well over 10,000 homes destroyed by Israel. It could cost more than $800 million to rebuild. 141 schools damaged, 5 hospitals closed as well. And infrastructure, fixing the damage to Gaza's only power station, plus its sewage and water systems, could cost as much as $3 billion. So you should see here there's a long and a short story in Gaza. The long story, that of siege, occupation and economic limitations. We're going to discuss that in a moment with the Palestinian Economic Minister. The short story, though, is about what's happening now. The power station's out, so there isn't enough electricity to treat wastewater and sewage. And the garbage is piling up too, right across the Strip. In this report, Nicole Johnston counts the cost of a military campaign that, as well as claiming lives, has made everyday life an extraordinary struggle.
Untreated sewage is flowing into the Mediterranean Sea. People still go fishing though. They don't catch much. But they say they have to try, knee-deep in filthy water. The smell is terrible.
We may get sick from the sea, but what can we do? I want to help my family survive. We need to eat.
Even when Gaza isn't in a war, it doesn't have enough electricity or infrastructure to treat all the waste produced by 1.8 million people. Now it's even worse. This sewage pumping station was bombed, a pool of untreated waste blocks the road heading north, and the overflow runs down to the sea. For the last 2 weeks, 30,000 cubic metres of raw sewage a day has flooded into the streets in northern and central Gaza.
Our effort now is to take the sewage to the ocean, even if it is not treated, okay? But the problem is we are not capable to bring the sewage from streets down to those facilities. So sewage now in the streets is flooded in the nearby areas, and it's contaminated some wells like Beit Lahia.
In Shati refugee camp, which is right on the sea, wastewater trickles through the streets.
Children are playing beside the sewage. Now it's here all day and we can't get rid of it. And I can't even start to describe how bad the smell is. I'm afraid for children more than us. It was a problem before the war, now it's worse.
If that wasn't bad enough, mounds of rubbish are getting bigger.
Another 200,000 people have moved into the centre of Gaza City since the war started, almost doubling the amount of rubbish produced to around 700 tonnes a day. And all of it is ending up here, right in the middle of the city.
The main landfill site is in East Gaza. It's in the middle of all the fighting, so there's no way this rubbish can be sent there. Gaza's beaches are empty, its cafes deserted. And when the sea breeze comes in, the stench of rotting garbage and sewage drifts across the city.
So you see the reality there, a reality that our next guest is trying to combat. Joining us from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank is Mohammad Shtayyeh. He is the Minister for PECDAR, which is the Palestinian Economic Council for Development and Reconstruction. And Minister, we thank you for joining us today. Can you clarify something for me, first of all? You are obviously based there in Ramallah in the West Bank, and that is where I'm sure a lot of your work is. Are you able to work freely in Gaza with the siege being in place for so long? What have you been able to do? Just clarify that.
No, our office has been in Gaza open since 1994, and we didn't really stop for one single day. We continued even under the most difficult circumstances. We continued to work in Gaza. Our team is there, and now they are really documenting all the damages that has caused by the Israeli aggression on our people.
You talk about those most difficult of circumstances, and that is obviously what we have seen in this last month. But I want to know about before that, before this latest Israeli aggression. Were you able to make any progress in Gaza? Because the siege, as I said, had been in place for years. Israel will presumably only change that once Hamas's opinion towards Israel changes, and so the siege has been ongoing and a real stalemate. What have you been able to achieve in Gaza in the meantime?
Well, look, this wave of damages that has been caused by Israel is actually the fourth wave of damages. The first damages that has taken place on the year 2002, and then another wave of damages took place 2008, 2009, and then another third wave in 2012, and now the recent wave of 2014. So damages in Gaza are actually accumulative, and quite a number of damages has not been fully repaired. There has been some construction by UNRWA for the different refugee houses that has been destroyed. Saudi Arabia has contributed to some of it. United Arab Emirates did, as well as Qatar, as I said, and Kuwait and so on. But really the most serious problems are still there. So I hope now, first, I hope that this will be the last reconstruction of Gaza, because I should mention to you, sir, that the bridge of Beit Hanun, I myself, my organization, my council has reconstructed the bridge of Beit Hanun. This is going to be the fourth time. And every time it is donors' money. And I think the donors, the international community, should really voice their voice loud to tell Israel to stop killing the Palestinian people and to stop the destruction of the infrastructure. Because on one hand, it is our infrastructure. On the other hand, it is your money, the donors' money, the international community money. So this Israel should not be given a free hand to do whatever it wants in the Palestinian territory, whether it is the West Bank, Jerusalem, or Gaza Strip.
Minister, if the siege is lifted, do you believe that Gaza will be able to pick itself up and rebuild properly? Because even if it's lifted, things will still be dependent on Israel and Hamas not going into conflict again, and that seems to be never guaranteed. If it is lifted, though, how quickly do you think Gaza could make a difference?
Well, it does. You see, if the siege is lifted, what I need to see is I want the people's life in Gaza to be different. I want the people to enjoy some sort of normal life, which they didn't enjoy for so many years. There has to be a flow of goods and people between the Palestinian territories themselves, and therefore the safe passage, quote unquote, between the West Bank and Gaza should be the most important issue that is to be given a priority when we are speaking about lifting siege on Gaza. Gaza does not need to rely and depend on the Israeli commodities. The West Bank commodities can provide the Gaza market for all what it needs, and so many products that are produced in Gaza can find markets in the rest of the Palestinian territory. So all what you need is really a flow of goods and people by lifting the siege. The Palestinians have always been very successful entrepreneurs. They built other people's homes. They have been successful businessmen. They have been very attached to their land and producing agriculture. We produce tomatoes 4 times a year in one single piece of land. So the Palestinians have been entrepreneurs, creative, and hardworking when they are given the right circumstances to be really a successful story. If they have been successful stories in other countries, why shouldn't they be successful stories in their own country?
So you talk about wanting to trade more freely, and that's understandable. One thing I did want to ask you about, and this is really also for you to inform our viewers, I think, because this is something they may not necessarily know about, and that is the gas deposits that are off the coast of Gaza. That is obviously something which could bring in a lot of money and a lot of trade. Is that something that the Palestinians have the capability?
By all means, you see, we did actually sign a contract with British Gas for the excavation on the coastal area of Gaza, and there is gas there, and it is going to be a very important natural resource for our economy the moment it is commercialized. It's not only that. You see, the Israelis are today digging oil fields in the West Bank on the border area that is classified to be a no man's land. Part of it is in the West Bank. Israel actually is digging for oil, and it is extracting oil from these oil fields with commercial rates. So Palestine does enjoy these natural resources. Unfortunately, the British gas contract was sabotaged by Israel, because Israel is actually excavating in the same area on one hand, and the issue of double taxation, and because of the war and all these obstacles that Israel is putting, the process didn't continue. But it is there, and it is our natural resource, and it should be utilized for the benefit of the Palestinian economy. And I think you see one important thing, it is those who have been killed, their families, and it is those who have been wounded, their families should benefit from this gas, and not any other international company who should really, harvest the outcome or the yield of these sort of fields. I think it should be all and fully assigned for the benefit of the people of Gaza, for the development of Gaza, and for the welfare of our people wherever they are.
Mohammad Shtayyeh from the Palestinian Economic Council, we thank you very much for your time today. And still ahead on Counting the Cost, the Ebola virus spreading through West Africa, killing hundreds and shutting down borders and trade. We look at the knock-on effects a little later on. Plenty more from Africa, though, to talk about this week, as the US President Barack Obama hosted 50 African leaders in Washington. Basically, he's been trying to convince them the US does want to do business with Africa. But the ulterior motive, perhaps, is to try to counter China's dominance there, because really the US isn't in the same league when it comes to Africa's 1 billion consumers. Have a look at this here. Last year, Barack Obama outlined his plans to spend $7 billion on power generation in Africa. While on his last visit to the continent in May, the Chinese premier outlined $10 billion for construction projects, rail, roads, housing, infrastructure, all these things. In fact, all told, China is willing to loan Africa $1 trillion by 2015, only next year. Or look at it in trade terms. It's not that the US isn't trying or lacks in contributions. In fact, US-Africa trade has doubled in the past decade to $110 billion. But look at this. From an almost standing start of $10 billion in 2000, China has well overtaken US trade levels. It's up at more than $200 billion last year. But here's the real surprise. The European Union outtrades both the United States and China with $470 billion worth. But let's look at what the US is trying to do to get back in the game. With a special report for Counting the Cost, here's Paddy Culhane reporting from Washington, D.C.
When did it start out with about 18 to 20?
At the first ever U.S.-African summit, the focus is on business, terrorism, and improving governance in Africa.
Fighting corruption lifts more than a country's balance sheet. Transparency and accountability attract greater investment. Transparency and accountability create a more competitive marketplace, one where ideas and products are judged by the market and by their merits, and not by a backroom deal or a bribe.
Fighting corruption is a familiar theme for the Obama administration when it comes to Africa, but some analysts say that is putting the U.S. at a disadvantage, especially when it comes to China.
They've said, we believe that corruption is something that countries evolve to be able to handle better when their economies develop. So let's not try to get them to change that much in their politics. Let's help them develop economically, and then they can take care of these problems, and their people can take care of these problems.
The president is making the case to Americans Africa matters more than just in humanitarian aid.
Some of the fastest growing economies in the world, a growing middle class, expanding sectors like manufacturing and retail, one of the fastest growing telecommunications markets in the world.
But this is the first time he's hosting a summit to try and tap into that potential. Since 2000, China has hosted 5. And it's showing in the trade numbers. In just 2 years, imports and exports between African countries and China have jumped from $127 billion to almost $200 billion. For the U.S., the opposite. Trade was $113 billion, but it's dropped to below $100 billion. Over 3 days, the summit will focus on changing that, but the president isn't going on his own charm offensive. Unlike China's leadership, he won't meet one-on-one with any of his African counterparts. He did announce a new $14 billion in business deals between U.S. and African companies. The argument from the White House, China is just using Africa for its natural resources, and the U.S. wants to be more of a trading partner.
We don't look to Africa simply for its natural resources. We recognize Africa for its greatest resource, which is its people and its talents and their potential.
But the president of the Republic of Congo disagrees with that characterization of his relationship with China.
China doesn't get its natural resources for free. If China needs to buy oil, they buy our oil at international market price. If they want wood, they buy wood at international market price. China doesn't take anything from us for free.
The U.S. president says it's time for the U.S. to compete in Africa, but it's clear other countries have a big head start, and one summit is unlikely to change that. Patty Culhane for Counting the Cost in Washington, D.C.
But for more on what the US and Africa might be able to achieve long-term, we turned to a regular guest on Counting the Cost, Hendrik du Toit, who is the CEO of Investec Asset Management. Investec is actually Africa's biggest investor with $37 billion in assets. He spoke to Ali Velship, the host of Real Money on Al Jazeera America.
It's very clear, actually, what America should be looking for. It's time for America to engage Africa at a strategic level and make sure its businesses and its influence gets enough traction to compete with the rest of the world, not in a negative sense, but to make sure they get their share of a growth story, of the last billion-person story really left in the world on the way to development. As far as the African leaders are concerned, what they want is American participation and especially American private sector investment in their economies. And so they have definitely got a reason to be here. And I think they're rather excited by the Power Africa initiative announced by the Obama administration.
Now, let me just sort of get a sense of what African investment there is to be had, because China has really overtaken in the last few years. They've really increased their investment, not in South Africa, where you're from as much, but certainly in other African nations that were requiring infrastructure or had extractive resources, natural resources, and things like that. So it seems like there's money flowing into Africa, and lots of it. What do Africans want Americans to invest in, and what industries can Americans invest in successfully?
I think foreign direct investment is now running at record levels into Africa. The Chinese have really overtaken the US in terms of trade, but actual stock of investment, if you include the American energy companies on the West African side and offshore, America is still larger than China. But I think it's time for American companies to participate more vigorously in the rise of the African consumer. There's a big middle class developing on the continent, and that is where the opportunity is, because clearly the global brands, the leading global companies in the world, many of them are American. And so that's the opportunity. Also, mid-sized American businesses can benefit from the growing economies. I mean, we just heard today Mozambique, which is an economy growing at near 10% rates. Mozambique has a capital investment program in its oil and gas industry of $25 billion.
Let me show our viewers the rates of return on foreign direct investment for Americans. Often when people think about foreign direct investment, we think of Asia, and Asia still provides the biggest return, 13.7%. But Africa is running second, 13%, and as a continent, it is running higher than emerging markets as a whole, which are at 11%. The question is, it's a high return, which often suggests high risk. Now, I think about Ghana. You know, President Obama sort of held Ghana up as an example of a great economy a couple of years ago, and now I read this morning that Ghana is looking to the IMF for a bailout. Is Africa stable?
I think Africa is, remember it's 54 countries. There are some very stable economies and regions. There are some areas where the stability is not as good as investors would require. But essentially, all emerging markets are volatile compared to developed markets, but the returns are potentially higher, and that's what investors want, and that's what businesses want, because businesses are looking for growth. As long as they manage those the volatility properly, they can do well. GE is doing pretty well out of Africa, I can tell you.
So let's take out the stability from the equation, because assuming that businesses need a couple things to invest, they want stability, they want rule of law. Let's look at sub-Saharan Africa, projected to grow at 5.4%, which makes it second only really again to Asia, including India and China. What are the impediments to investment there? If you've got rule of law, you've got political stability. In South Africa, certainly you have infrastructure, although there are big infrastructure developments going on. Is infrastructure the biggest challenge in Africa?
I think infrastructure and scale of market. So one of the things African governments need to do is make sure they organize their regions properly so that an investor can access more than one country, because there are a number of smaller countries there. And so it's trade policy in regions, and it's physical infrastructure. Do you have the ports available? Are the roads there? And in that sense, the Chinese have done the world a great favor by building many of these roads and facilities over the last few years, and therefore helping businesses to reach the markets which are there.
Europe's engagement in Africa is actually twice that of China. Now, is that lingering effects of colonial relationships, or does Europe understand Africa?
I think Europe has been involved with Africa for a very long time, from the colonial times, but therefore never quite withdrew and continued to engage. So what's important for Africa is that at least they get the most dynamic economy in the world, the US, the most powerful economy in the world, involved as well, and not just look either east or to their old colonial masters.
Finally this week, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And again, this is sort of like Gaza, at least in the sense that there are immediate losses of life to deal with now, but also a lot of knock-on effects. With Ivory Coast and Senegal closing their borders with Liberia and Guinea to try to stop the spread, regional trade is being shut down. Now, the World Bank has pledged $200 million to fight Ebola, but it also predicts the outbreak could wipe a whole percentage point off of Guinea's growth. Shihab Ratanzi sat down with the president of Senegal, Macky Sall, to discuss the crisis.
Ebola est une maladie qui a une propagation exponentielle.
Ebola is a disease that spreads exponentially, so it is important that the international community participates and contributes, first of all, at the level of research, but also at the level of resource mobilizing in order to come to control this pandemic.
And that's very interesting, because there is a sense that the international community has not mobilized on Ebola because they feel it's an African disease. The pharmaceutical companies think there's not much money in a vaccine or a cure. Do you think that they are doing enough in the West to try and combat Ebola and research into a meaningful way to prevent Ebola from spreading?
Oui, je pense que la réaction de la communauté internationale est assez faible.
Yes, I do think that the response of the international community has been fairly weak so far. We are pleased with the pledge of $100 million recently announced by the World Health Organization. However, that is not sufficient given the spread of the disease, and the international community should not make the mistake to consider this as an African phenomenon. The world is now a global village. There's traveling by plane, by sea, and other means. We should not believe that just by closing the borders and preventing flights that will go ahead and control this pandemic. Just realize what would happen if a single case is discovered in the US or in Europe, what that would have as an impact on the world economy. So we should not consider this just as an African pandemic, and the world should actually treat it the same way it did with the H1N1 virus, which was started in Asia. So unless the international community handles it in the same fashion, there will not be very effective fighting.
As far as the day-to-day management of the outbreak of Ebola is concerned, how much coordination is there between the West African nations affected or potentially affected? Is there a daily mechanism of information flowing between countries?
Oui, nous avons d'abord en Afrique de l'Ouest ce qu'on appelle...
There's representation of the World Health Organization at a regional level. They are working in collaboration with the regional health body, and they coordinate efforts for the 15 countries of the region. If you look, for instance, at the case of Senegal, there is a system for early detection at the level, for instance, at the airport, so that they can figure out and find out if people who are coming in are affected. And this is valid in all the countries in the region. There may be a need for more information sharing, and there is definitely a need for those countries to be assisted in the efforts that they make.
And that is our show for this week. More for you online, though, at aljazeera.com/programs. The Counting the Cost page has individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on, as well as, down the right-hand side here, the social media feed with all of people's comments and feedback, which you can join in as well. You can tweet either me at KamalAJE or our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, and do use the hashtag Counting the Cost as well, or just drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.